Good morning. Welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Kelly. I will be joining you this morning for Fitness Athlete Friday, best day of the week. And our topic for today is going to be lumbar flexion range of motion. Specifically, why do we want to look for that within our CrossFit population? How are we assessing it? And a couple strategies to be able to improve lumbar flexion for these athletes. But before we get into our topic, let me tell you about a couple things coming up on our fitness athlete calendar soon. And so as far as the live courses are going, October 9th is a busy weekend. We have both Mitch and Alan. They're going to be up in Alaska, while Zach is going to be over in Denver, Colorado. So catch them out there. That following weekend, all three of them are going to be in Fenton, Michigan, which is always a blast to have the full faculty together. So feel free to head over and sign up online there. And then towards the end of the year, November 13th and 14th, our live course is going to be in Chicago, my old stomping grounds. So feel free to catch Zach and myself in Chicago. That's going to be a great weekend. And then as far as our online courses go, we have our pregnancy and postpartum course starting online November 1st. And then the last cohort of our Essential Foundations course for the fitness athlete starts December 6th. And that's always selling out. So if you're on the fence about signing up for that, just do it now. So head over to ptonice.com and register, get your space, and we'll see you online. For a full list of our courses and schedule, head over to ptonice.com. All right, so let's get into our topic for today. So like I mentioned, lumbar flexion, as specifically the range of motion of how much available lumbar flexion do we have. It's something that we should be looking for and improving if it's limited with our CrossFit population. So let's start with why. So it's the second most common area that athletes are experiencing injury while participating in CrossFit after shoulder pain. And so if you're a physical therapist that's commonly seeing fitness athletes, CrossFit athletes, or wants to see more of these athletes, treating the low back is obviously somewhere you're going to want to be prepared to treat well. So in my history of working with plenty of CrossFit athletes, the flexion intolerant low back pain is one of the more common presentations of low back pain that I was seeing, at least. And I think of two scenarios that fit into that category. So one could be obviously like presenting with that flexion intolerant low back pain. And I'm sure we can all agree that if somebody is highly irritable into flexion, that we're temporarily removing those painful movements from their routine for a short term to allow things to calm down. And then if it's never reintroduced into their activities, whether it's just in daily life or within the gym, they can tend to become really stiff or even fearful of that movement, thinking it's harmful because it's associated with pain. And so if we've never been exposing ourselves back into flexion, it often can become stiff, just like if you don't use it, you lose it, right? And then another scenario of athletes that you're going to find are limited into flexion. I actually fall into this category of I have plenty of extension range of motion, but not as much flexion range of motion. I have a history of doing gymnastics and track and field before CrossFit. So I've lived a lot of my life in extension and just not as much in flexion. So I don't necessarily have a history of any back discomfort, but if you take a look, I don't have a plenty of available lumbar flexion range of motion. And so this is something to note because when these types of athletes are performing CrossFit workouts where they're doing a lot of flexion-based movements like deadlifts, kettlebell swings, dumbbell snatches, devil presses now, sandbag or D-ball cleans, etc., they're the ones that are often presenting with, oh, I kind of feel a little achy after doing those types of workouts. And that's probably why they're coming to see you at some point. So the first question that you're probably asking though is, well, why do we need lumbar flexion? Isn't one of the points of performance for all of these movements to maintain a braced neutral spine throughout the lift? And you're absolutely right. But what we need to do is take a look at the physics of what's actually happening at the spine when we're doing movements like, say, the deadlift. So we have a couple different force vectors that are being placed on the spine. We have some compression forces, we have a torque force on the spine, and we have some anterior shear forces that are placed when we lift heavy things off the ground. What's happening when our muscles surrounding the spine are engaged, like the paraspinals, our core muscles, our lats, when all of those are engaged, those muscle forces oppose the forces that I just mentioned. That's why we are always encouraging to maintain a brace neutral spine position while lifting. And so obviously strengthening those muscles is going to help oppose those forces, but being able to look at our true range of motion of lumbar flexion, available lumbar flexion that we have, is going to be a part of that puzzle too. So as far as being able to absorb those forces. So I have kind of like an analogy to help make sense out of this. We're probably all familiar with reintroducing jump landing skills to our post-op ACL patients, right? We would never cue them to land really stiff-legged or like with only 3 degrees of knee flexion. We're cueing them to absorb all that force and land into that squat. So the joint itself isn't taking a lot of that force, the muscles are. And so I think we can make a parallel here with lumbar flexion, range of motion when we're doing flexion-based movements. So if we only have available 2 to 3 degrees of lumbar flexion, we're not able to absorb those forces while doing a lot of those movements. And when CrossFit athletes are typically working up to either 1 rep max occasionally, where they're really testing that strength to be able to hold the line while we're deadlifting, or we're doing medium weight for many reps. Say, I think of the workout Diane, which is 21-15-9 rep scheme of deadlifts and handstand push-ups. So obviously the first 0 through 15 reps are going to look fantastic. And by rep 43, 44, 45, we're going to see some muscular fatigue if we're really going for speed. And that doesn't mean we're seeing form breakdown while we're just lifting at all costs, but the muscles themselves are getting fatigued. Therefore, if the muscles aren't opposing that force as effectively as rep 1 through 15, we may see some more force through the spine with that anterior shear force. So having some lumbar flexion available motion is going to help absorb that. Another scenario, to take this even further, is a sandbag clean or a D-ball clean. I just did a competition last weekend and they had programmed 30 D-ball cleans. So picking up a med ball all the way from the floor and hoisting it to the hip over the shoulder 30 times with 150 pounds for the men and 100 pounds for the ladies. And to be able to bend all the way down, get your hands underneath that heavy of an object. There were 200 athletes in that competition, and I don't think one of them maintained a brace neutral spine position just because you have to get so low. And I don't think anybody's spine exploded out of their bodies, but we actually saw some lumbar flexion on board when doing that lift. And not for nothing, but I think that's probably going to mimic what we're seeing our humans actually doing in the real world. Picking up a heavy bag, picking up a heavy box. That's not always going to be set up on perfect bumpers right at mid-shin height to be able to lift. So what I would argue is that we need some of that lumbar flexion to be able to do that successfully. Another analogy that I'm thinking is we've all seen the stiff shoulder athlete that only has about 170 degrees of available shoulder flexion. Well, it sure makes sense that if they're pressing a barbell overhead into hopefully 180 degrees of flexion, some of those structures in the shoulder are going to be irritated, right? So if we only have 0 to 3 degrees of lumbar flexion and we're trying to do a ton of those flexion-based movements, it makes sense that some of those structures in the low back are also going to get irritated doing 2 sets of 30 D-ball cleans of 100 pounds, for example. So that's my reasoning behind why is this an area we're going to want to restore, even though we're aiming to maintain that brace neutral spine position only always, essentially, for most of our functional lifts. And so now I would encourage you to take a look at the available lumbar flexion that your athletes have. So if somebody's coming to you with low back pain, we're probably assessing their standing lumbar flexion or active range of motion into flexion. We're assessing how far can they reach. Is it symptomatic? Can we add overpressure? And tracking that as our objective asterisk signs. But we can take this a step further. So in our fitness athlete course, for our functional movements, we have mobility breakouts for all of them. And for the deadlift, lumbar flexion range of motion is one of them. So we can take this a step further and assess the quality of their flexion. So more often than not, as people flex forward, we're going to see a nice global rounding of the whole spine. The point of this topic essentially though is assessing that lumbar flexion stiffness. So what we'll see is athletes have a ton of flexion through their thoracic spine, but it's actually really flat after that the thoracolumbar junction to the pelvis, and so it's pretty stiff there. So what I'm doing is assessing that quality. Another way you can do this is have an athlete get on all fours and perform a cat-cow movement. And you can even cue them, like have your hand right on their lower back where you're trying to see the motion, really flex into my hand and see really how much they can round at that position. So sometimes motor control issues may be on board too. And so I don't necessarily have I want to see this amount of lumbar flexion motion, but we're just assessing that global availability throughout the whole chain, essentially. And so that's where I'm picking up on, okay, maybe I need to work on some motion here to be able to absorb these forces a little bit better for this athlete. And so let me just tell you about I think I have 4 strategies that we like to introduce to our athletes depending obviously on irritability and where they're at. So take, for example, that cat-cow position. That's a really nice way to start to introduce some unloaded lumbar flexion. And so what we like to do is use one of those long rogue bands, just like a red band, have the athlete stabilize the band in their hands and have it wrap around their lower back where we're trying to target to get some more motion. So we get some really intentional lumbar flexion in those lower segments. And so we're cueing them as they round into the band. We want to stretch the band. We're exhaling as we round our back. We're trying to crunch our abs down to get more flexion out of that. So that's a nice place to start as far as gaining lumbar flexion back in our athletes. And then we like to progress them to a Jefferson curl. And there's a million ways, well, maybe not a million, but a bunch of ways that you can do this. So one way we like is to start on a wall. So if we start with our back fully against a wall, then they still get that tactile cueing of trying to peel their back off the wall one vertebrae at a time. And oftentimes, I experience this myself as well, I'm doing great, and then I get towards that thoracolumbar junction, and then all of a sudden it's a giant chunk that comes off the wall. And so we can really dial in on trying to create some motion through there. We can add a little bit of load by hugging a nice med ball to the chest, 14 or 20 pounds. And that actually feels really nice to be able to open up once we've gotten past that high irritability stage of managing some flexion intolerant low back pain. And so then we can also progress to a typical Jefferson curl while we're standing, and we can progress even further into holding a kettlebell while we're doing it to strengthen the spine into those flex postures. That's basically one of the goals that we want to see before we're setting them free if they've had some flexion intolerant low back pain. I recently created a post where some of these exercises are on there. So once this gets uploaded, I'll post that after if you want a visual on what these exercises actually look like. And then one last one that I had just recently learned from Jordan Berry, shout out to him, was a zombie curl. So it's essentially like an ab exercise where we're doing a Jefferson curl, but starting in supine. So we start with the chin first, and then you're slowly trying to sit up to tall sitting, or like an L sit, which is really challenging on the anterior structures of our core. If you try it, don't yell at me, but you might cramp. I'm just warning you. I definitely did the first time. And there's ways you can scale that down to meet somebody's, wherever they're at with their ab strength. You can bend the knees, you can add a band to assist, but that's a nice way. We always like to gain strength around the emotion that we have. So the Jefferson curl is great for loading up the posterior structures of the spine, and then our zombie curl is a nice way to strengthen the anterior structures of the spine into flexion. So those are just a couple suggestions as far as exercises that we like to help improve lumbar flexion. So I hope that makes sense for all of you. If you have questions surrounding the why am I looking at lumbar flexion, even though we want a brace neutral spine position, I'd love to have conversations surrounding it. But other than that, keep that in the back of your mind when you're working with your fitness athletes. Head to the gym now. But have a great weekend, and we'll see you back on Monday for more PT on Ice daily shows. Take care.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.